Several people sent me news items referring to the kerfuffle at Benedictine College in Kansas. I've been asked by some of those to comment and react to the video. At a high level of generality, there was a lot in Harrison Butker's commencement address to recommend it, from my point of view. Getting more specific, however, I do think a few problems become evident. So I have a couple of criticisms, which I'll try to briefly summarize. But I'd like to make two things clear at the outset. First of all, I had absolutely no idea who Harrison Butker was or is prior to receiving a link to his speech. I'm not a football fan. I don't watch it in general, so I'm not specifically a fan of his, but I'm also not even sophisticated enough to be a fan of a rival team. I wasn't against him or for him or anything like that. Now, from the standpoint of the so-called culture war, where it's common just to like or dislike something, Facebook style, I would say that his speech gets a thumbs up from me if I'm restricted just to those two options, like or dislike. There's no question, in my mind, that homemakers are great and they're undervalued, that sexual mores in the culture are far too loose, that priests should be distinguishable from the laity, that bishops ought to be vigorously and courageously defending authentic Catholicism. So on all those points, I say hooray. But if you look more closely at the culture war sides, I think you see that they display variation, both sides. You can certainly find this on the side that click the dislike button. It's not just blue-haired social justice warrior atheist types. Also, the sisters of Saint Scholastica, who evidently had some role in running the school, that is, Benedictine. Similar variation is apparent on the like side. And I think a fundamental question here is, what does being authentically Catholic mean? So take the sisters. They premise their opposition on a commitment to, in their words, the Church of Vatican-II and Pope Francis. Now, the people who attend and promote the traditional Latin Mass, and by his own account this would seemingly include Harrison Butker, those people are often, and not without reason, thought of as quote-unquote traditionalists. But the word traditional and its cognates is quite tricky. Now, in what follows here, I'm going to ignore the liberal Catholic side of things. And the reason for that is, in my experience, I'm not aware of liberals referring to themselves as traditionalists. And here I mean liberal in a social sense. People who are, say, for abortion rather than against it, or people who are, in a Catholic context, for, say, the ordination of women rather than against it. Some of these notions would need to be sharpened up and should be, but hopefully that gives you a quick fix on what I'm talking about. Now, there's a ton that could be said here, but let me just start with this. There are several important distinctions among people who claim to be, quote-unquote, traditionalists. Unfortunately, I don't think that I can articulate my reaction to the current commencement address without wading into these matters just a little bit. So here, I want to name only a single distinction, which I think is extremely relevant. That's roughly this. On the one hand, you have traditionalists who have got problems with Vatican-II and with the new Mass. Now, so I don't assume too much here, there are really two forms of the Mass that are the most relevant to this kind of conversation. It's quite true that there are other rites, but I don't want to get into those complexities here. So for present purposes, I'm just going to say that there are two main forms of the Mass. One of them is the traditional Latin Mass. There was an important and major codification of this form of the Mass at the Council of Trent, which occurred roughly in the mid-16th century. It's referred to sometimes as the Tridentine Mass, and it was codified largely in reaction to the Protestant, quote, Reformation, which of course officially started, say, in 1517 when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door at Wittenberg. Proponents of the Latin Mass, very strident proponents of that, will often say that the Mass is much older than the Council of Trent, and that the new Mass, which was rolled out in the late 1960s by Pope Paul VI after Vatican II concluded, these Catholics, often called traditionalists or trads, will say that the new Mass is a radical departure from what came before it. In fact, what came before it for roughly 1,500 to 1,900 years. So to trads, this is a big deal. So some Traditionalists have problems with both Vatican-II and the new Mass. Now that, for example, is a position, I think, roughly of the Society of St. Pius X. The traditionalists, in the sense that came first, I think, in 20th century history, were the people that I just described. The people who had a problem with Vatican II, a problem with the new Mass, and wanted to go back to, say, an earlier time, kind of a reactionary position. But on the other hand, you've got a group of people who accept Vatican II and accept the Novus Ordo, or the new Mass. But they may, and often do, have problems with something like this: the way that Vatican II's teachings are applied or interpreted, or the way a particular Mass is celebrated. An example here might be somebody like Bishop Robert Barron. Conservatives tend to downplay the antiquity of the traditional Latin Mass in favor of playing up the Church's ability to tinker with the components of the Mass. So their bottom line is basically that the Mass has been changed numerous times in the past. So they'll suggest that the change by Paul VI in the 1960s shouldn't bother us, especially since the new Mass's celebration in various vernacular languages, like English, is merely a translation of an official Latin rite. So when conservatives talk about the traditional Latin Mass, they'll often say things like, it's a beautiful form of the Mass, but the new Mass is beautiful as well. They might say it was the Mass of Pope St. Paul VI or Pope St. John Paul II, and so on. Now, as a first pass, you could perhaps gloss this dispute as one between people like the conservative traditionalists, such as Robert Barron, who seem friendly toward modernism, and people like the Society of St. Pius X, who are less friendly toward modernism. And here, that word modernism is probably as confusing as any of the other words, but without getting too deeply into it, let's just think of somebody who's a little bit warmed up toward progressivism, a little bit friendly toward innovation, and so on. And a person who's unfriendly to those things would be less modern. And so, given all this, my major criticism, I suppose you'd call it, of Harrison Butker's speech is that, in my view, he tends to slide back and forth between these two poles without commenting on the tension and perhaps without even recognizing it himself. Now, why do I say this? Most glaring, in my opinion, is the way that Harrison Butker advocates for the traditional Latin Mass. He says it isn't preference or pride. By saying it isn't pride, I presume he's directing that towards some liberals who think that, or accuse more conservative-leaning people of being elitist because they're clinging to, in their view, an older form of the Mass and they think they're better than other people or something along the lines of that. I want to set that aside and I want to think instead about the word preference. And what you want to ask yourself, I think, is who does think that attending the traditional Latin Mass is a matter of preference? For whom is it a matter of preference? Harrison Butker says for him it is not a matter of preference. So who's he addressing there? And in the context of the dispute between traditionalists, on the one hand, the historic traditionalists, and conservative traditionalists, like Bishop Barron, it's the conservatives who think of it as preference. Bishop Barron routinely defends the new Mass by saying things like, it was the Mass of Pope St. John Paul II. The traditional Latin Mass to Bishop Barron might be beautiful, yes, but so is the new Mass to a conservative like Barron. Both forms of the Mass are acceptable. So given that, what explains whether an individual Catholic attends the new Mass or the traditional Latin Mass? And the answer is the individual Catholic's preference. But traditionalists, in the older sense, trads, talk very differently. Trads frequently give the impression that true historic Catholicism is embodied in the traditional Latin Mass. The new Mass is just a mess. And then they divide with each other as to how messy it actually is. I'll have to defer that for another time. But when Harrison Butker says that people should move if they don't have access to a traditional Latin Mass, and he says that attending the traditional Latin Mass doesn't come down to preference, he seems, by saying those things, to be speaking trad lingo. On the other hand, the conservative position points out that the Novus Ordo is the ordinary form of the Mass, meaning that it's the one that's officially sanctioned, whereas the traditional Latin Mass is called an extraordinary form. It's sanctioned, but only in exceptional positions, extraordinary positions. And this distinction between the Novus Ordo being ordinary and the Latin Mass being extraordinary goes all the way back to the new Mass's architect, Paul VI. I mean, I know that the Concilium actually constructed the Mass, but Paul VI put his approval on it. And this distinction between the new Mass being the ordinary and the traditional Latin Mass being the extraordinary form was continued by John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis. The only difference, really, between each of those that I just named is how much latitude each of these popes extend to churches or priests in order to say the Latin Mass. In other words, do they have a broad permission for the extraordinary form, or do they narrow it? Now, you can make the argument that Paul VI had a very narrow approach to the traditional Latin Mass, and that approach was widened by John Paul II, that it was further widened by Benedict XVI, and that Francis has narrowed it again considerably. But in these cases, it's not a matter of one Mass is the true Catholic Mass and the other isn't. It's simply a matter of one is the ordinary form and the other is, say, for special occasions. But it's not that way with traditionalists, with trads. Some trads go so far as to say that Trent defined the traditional Latin Mass as the one and only Mass for all time, and that no subsequent Catholics, even popes, have any authority whatsoever to forbid, alter, or restrict the traditional Latin Mass. So here's the puzzle. Harrison Butker seems more aligned with trads when he talks about the Mass, except that throughout his speech, he also peppered it with praise of people like, quote, Saint Josemaría Escrivá and Saint Damien Molokai. But these two individuals were canonized by Vatican II popes. And some argue both of these people, Escrivá and Damien, displayed modernist tendencies. Or even, in the case of Escrivá especially, who started Opus Dei, they may have helped pave the way to Vatican II and pave the way to the new Mass. So what I'm suggesting is that Harrison Butker is displaying a tension. It's almost like he can't make up his mind between being a full-throated traditionalist and saying Vatican II, the new Mass, and so on, just went off the rails, and being a conservative, where the conservative position, though, definitely would say that the traditional Latin Mass is good, but it certainly is a matter of preference. Now, there are subsidiary points that I could make. For instance, throughout his speech, he also lamented that priests just don't seem to be respected and bishops aren't stepping up to the plate, and those points, I feel like, are also somewhat at odds with his implied affinity for Vatican II and what comes after Vatican II. And it's in this sense, and I'll draw from Father Anthony Cicada here to make this point. Father Cicada, he was a sedevacantist, meaning he believed that there were no occupants in the papal office since Pius XII. Father Cicada makes the point that the new Mass is predicated upon a different theology than the old Mass. The new Mass, in his opinion, and in his analysis, I should say, is predicated upon something he terms assembly theology. And it's not his term, that's the language that he employs. But the upshot is that if Cicada is right about that, assembly theology underlies the new Mass, and it tends to diminish, if not obliterate, the distinction between priests and laity. But in any case, my point here is that there are other tensions that show up, but I think I've identified kind of the main one. Finally, there's kind of a little, I don't want to call it a nitpick, because I do think that it is somewhat consequential, and that is Harrison Butker repeatedly says, stay in your lane. Stay in your lane presumably means stick to what you know, stick to what you're good at, and don't venture outside of those specialties. To me, that's a rather odd point for him to make, given that he's a professional football player and his degree appears to have been in industrial engineering. Presumably, he might have taken some theology courses, but taking a few theology courses does not a theology major make. And so it does seem a bit curious for him to repeatedly press this point that one should stay in their lane, because it's not clear how he can hold to that principle and at the same time justify making comments about the church, ecclesiology, sacramentalism, and so on. But again, when you think of it from a culture war point of view, I think it does definitely have a lot to recommend it, but maybe my main criticism is it just doesn't have the level of sophistication that I would like to see in theological matters, because I do think many of these issues that I've touched on here matter quite a lot. I'll cut it off there and hopefully be able to pick up some of these strands in future videos.